Why has literature been censored in the past, and what impact does this have on marginalised groups? And what can communities learn and share from each other to create change? Welcome to the Possible Podcast. This is episode 3 of the first series. Really, this is all about bringing creative thinking into arts and humanities research. I'm Paul Drury-Bradey, entrepreneur in residence, and I'm interested in community, collaboration, new connections, and making ideas matter. The big ideas in this podcast are based on research from Durham University's Classics department. I wanted to explore ideas around censorship and literature and how this impacts LGBT communities and shapes the experience of marginalised groups.
Hi, my name's Professor Jennifer Ingleheart. I'm a Professor of Latin in the Department of Classics and Ancient History at Durham University. What my research has done is looked at something that really has had very little attention until recently, and that's the important role that ancient Rome has played in modern ideas about sexuality and sex. A lot of people look back to ancient Greece and saw noble examples there, models that they wanted to follow. But Rome has very much not been part of that conversation about the influence that the ancient world has had upon modern ideas about homosexuality. And my research looks at how Rome has actually been every bit as important as Greece. People have been interested in Rome, but they've turned to Rome to look for more queer possibilities for a world where sexuality isn't problematic in quite the same way as it could be in the modern world, where relations between people of the same sex are just taken for granted and a huge range of sexual combinations just happen in Rome. There's a lot more talk about sex in Roman literature than in a lot of Greek literature. And a lot of the people who've looked to ancient Rome have been those people who haven't been frightened of sex, but wanted to find models in the past of a culture that was actually interested in sex and happy to talk about it in very frank terms.
It struck me there's a powerful connection between literature and identity. Jennifer explained a lot of her research explored hidden histories, an idea of shining a light on unexplored classics and cultures.
My research has opened up a range of hidden histories for modern people who are queer, who just didn't realise that this was part of their heritage. I think a lot of queer people are well aware of that model of Greece, of people looking back to very positive examples of noble, desexualised love. You know, homosexuality and sexuality, sex is an important part of that. And I think queer people that I've spoken to have found it quite liberating and pleasing that when you look to Roman homosexuality, you've got an ancestry there as well, where sex is actually not something that's out of the picture, where it is a full part of being homosexual.
Jennifer's research has been supported by the British Academy, the Loeb Classical Library Foundation, and the Harry Ransom Centre in the States, big partners. So, how is this research into classics and Roman sexuality relevant to communities today?
I think it's really easy to see censorship as something that's happened in the past. Something I did with my research as a means of letting more people out there know about what I'm doing is I put on an exhibition at the Bodleian Library. It was called Story of Phi, and for the first time we put on display books that had been hidden away from most readers. You had to get special permission to access these books, and most of the books were hidden away, not available to all readers because of their sexual content. And a lot of the books that I was looking at were books that look back to ancient Rome for talking about sex, as a way of talking about sex, as an excuse for talking about sex. And the Phi collection, that's the shelf mark that the books that were apart from the other books, the Phi collection no longer accepts books. There aren't books being kept away from readers in the Bodleian Library because of their sexual content anymore. That doesn't happen. And I think it's quite easy to think that censorship for sexual reasons is over, but that's just not true. Again and again, stories come up of libraries trying to censor books that deal with sex and sexuality. Schools try to prevent their students reading about same-sex love. It's very much something that's going on in the world nowadays. It's not something that's about the past, that's over and done with.
Looking outward, internationally, and into the future, Jennifer has some big ideas about how the impact of her research could shape things for different communities.
I think it would be really good if more people understood that censorship isn't just something that's happened in the past. that censorship is something that's been applied to and is still applied to books that talk about same-sex sexuality. And I'd like to see a broader conversation about what sorts of books people are allowed to read and what sort of boundaries we think should be in place. I think it's regrettable that censorship has happened in the past. And I'd like people to have a sort of more open, more adult, more honest conversation about censorship than currently happens.
Keen to understand this more, I welcome Simone Harris, an international LGBTQ campaigner to Durham in 2019. After introducing her to Jennifer, I wanted to find out more about her practice and the impact of censorship on marginalised people around the world.
I am curator of arts, culture. I'm a creative industry specialist. I work in tourism, and I'm also a LGBTQ activist in the Caribbean. I believe in using art as a platform for advocacy. And I've been spending the past couple of years working with young people across the LGBTQ community here in Jamaica to provide access to opportunities that will allow them to share their stories, because I think it's no single story that speaks to the queer experience in the Caribbean, and the telling of stories is absolutely critical to the fight for equality in this part of the world, and I'm committed to creating more spaces that provide for that. You don't hear our voices in narratives if you don't see us coming out in the storytelling. You tend to feel that, well, this community doesn't exist. And I mean, it's not just unique to the LGBTQ experience, to any minority or vulnerable group. If you're not integrated into society in any kind of way, then it's almost as if you don't exist. You don't exist. And we find that we can claim power through storytelling, right? Through presenting narratives showing that, yes, there are different kinds of people throughout the community. There are different kinds of challenges that we face, none worth more than the other. Just that there's a myriad of experiences, and storytelling in any form, whether it be visual arts, whether it be literature, is key to reminding people that we exist. You can, at the individual level, blind yourself to the narrative, but it doesn't change the fact that we exist in society, we contribute to society in many valuable ways. And that's why, for me, it is always something so beautiful when a queer writer, especially from this part of the world, crosses over into, that commercial space where literature is valued and is respected, and the stories that they're telling mirror the experiences on the ground. So in the Caribbean, you'll have writers like Kai Miller, you'll have Nicole Dennis Ben, Nicole explores themes of romance. You'll have Marlon James, taking us all the way back in a historical sense too, with the storytelling. And these writers and what the work that they do contributes to ensuring that, in a sense of continuity, we don't forget that queer people exist and that queer people have always been a part of the narrative.
Simone said her work in the Caribbean had been censored in the past.
I have a collection of photos called The Tribe, and they involve, presentation through nudity. And, when nudity is involved, people tend to shy away because it might be triggering in a certain sense. But my work, there are many places that it would not have been accepted for presentation simply because it involves nudity. And for me, nudity is speaking to vulnerability, but there's an inability to see the nude body, the nude Black body outside of a certain context, and that limits the opportunities available to continue or to take that conversation into certain spaces, So from a personal perspective, the censoring of work, there are creative ways to get around censoring. There are now much more opportunities through technology and social media to share your work and reach more people. You don't have to depend on, from a visual artist perspective, the gallery spaces, which come with so much pre-existing conditions, to put it in that way. You're not limited to that to get your story told or out there in the public realm. So I think censorship is always a thing in art because of interpretation, but then the artist and the activist has the power to leverage new media, to leverage technology to reach the audience that they want to reach with their work. And that's a new front in the battle against censorship of art.
Literature and deciding who can access it is a type of control mechanism, Simone explained. She told me that it was a deep, complicated thing to explain how access shapes how communities think today.
When I was in Durham and having that conversation with yourself and Jennifer, you just realize how distance, separation, the separateness sort of contributes to, a disconnect in the way that we're processing history or consuming it or analyzing it, because there's so many missing pieces. And so coming from the Caribbean, coming from a small island, 2.9 million people, coming from Jamaica to the UK and being around artists and curators and writers and academics and recognizing that, okay, we're looking at the same topic here, but my experience of it, my lived experience, so different from yours, because I could see where in many sense literature was used in my culture as a control mechanism. They're talking about access to it, first of all. And then you're talking about in the formalized education system, you're talking about how it is used to perpetuate certain narratives and certain ways of being, certain ways of thinking. And I am forced to, whenever I leave the island and I'm able to be in a space to learn and share and I come back, I'm forced now to look at my people, to look through the lens of, is this really us? Or is this what has been taught to us? These ways of thinking. Do you understand? So even for the queer community, the issue of homophobia, how did the way Jamaicans were taught pre-independence, pre-emancipation, how did those things contribute to how we think today? So the disconnect, I think, if we're able to connect more, share more, and have dialogue and provoke certain conversations, then we could together create a tomorrow that is much more connected, much more united than we are today.
Back closer to home, I wanted to find out more about Durham's LGBTQ communities.
I'm Mel Metcalf and I chair and organise the annual Durham Pride, which is a charity, and we support the LGBT plus community in and around Durham. We help raise awareness and try to improve responses for victims and survivors of same-sex domestic violence and abuse, which includes sexual violence as well. It's about celebrating diversity and inclusion in County Durham, but also our annual event is about putting a fight towards equality and making sure that people listen to the inequalities in and around Durham. So our main event does that, but from that we then support victims and survivors of domestic violence and same-sex sexual violence. And what we do there is we go to agencies and we support them to start thinking about what it's like and the barriers that are included in a relationship. Now, a heterosexual relationship, those barriers still exist about reporting, but then add all the barriers about inclusiveness, the diversity, the lack of equality, all that kind of stuff. And what do we do, or how do we support those victims and survivors to overcome those barriers? And it's not about LGBT people doing that. It's about people in a service, professionals, supporting those clients, supporting those people to first disclose and report what's happened, but secondly, respond properly, make sure that they have some safe space to go somewhere they can take time to look at their options and what those options look like differently in a same-sex relationship to it does in a heterosexual relationship.
Mel explained Durham Pride was rapidly growing and said the university's huge student population had helped to make it a really successful event.
Durham Pride started in 2014 when myself and Jamie Lawson, who was an academic at Durham University, I asked him the question, why has our fantastic, fabulous, diverse, and it is a diverse county, a beautiful county, not celebrate some of those people in it, the LGBT community, for example? And we thought, why don't we put a pride together? So 2014, we organised, in January, we organised a pride for the May. The amazing thing about that was we were told by many that we just couldn't do it in that time frame. We were told by others that it would be a student event, so why bother? And other people just literally said, well, is there a community in Durham? So we had our first one on that night. It was a Thursday night. And we expected maybe 10. There'd be me, Jamie, and a few more with a couple of glow sticks. And we ended up getting about 2,000 people there to the event, which was a low-key event, but it was our first. Fast forward to our 6th Pride last year, and we have moved now to the field in Durham. It's called the Sands Field. And an estimated 20 to 25,000 people attended that event. So in that short space of time, there's obviously an appetite for a day when people can come out and celebrate who they are. So an appetite to actually protest for more diversity, more inclusion in Durham. And I'll talk about County Durham in particular, because Durham City is unique. It has a large student base. And what we know from that student base is an awful lot of LGBT and we take Q for questioning the sexuality will come and explore during Pride and sometimes feel safe and be who they want to be for that day. But we also know that in certain towns and villages across County Durham, there's no support, there's nothing there. And I used to joke about it, but in some areas of our glorious county, you'd have a life expectancy of about 5 seconds if you were to hold your partner's hand down the street or, say, a concert where I live. I honestly believe that after these 5 or 6 years, that has changed. We are seeing much more acceptance. And I'm not saying that the 20, 25,000 people that came last year would all identify LGBT, but I would say that all of them now understand and accept that our community is here, it's staying, and it's important to have those allies with us. So those people whose families, friends, sons, daughters, mums, dads, whatever, can spend that one day and just celebrate that diversity. But there's more work to be done, and we'll continue to do that.
Mel told me events in Durham are getting bigger, with more banners and more parades. But for many people here, it is in fact a type of protest, not a party. I was curious about his ideas being censored in the past.
Pride for some is a protest, and it's important that 3 years ago, we managed to create our parade. So we never had a parade before. So on that parade, we have people with banners. We have all kind of so there's lots of people there to protest around, the exclusion for the trans community, for example. Protest around the diversity that's not happening in certain areas. So we managed to include that. So from then, about 3 years ago, that censorship kind of stopped. And actually now we are seen as a pride for everybody, though, a pride for anybody who wants to come along and protest, anybody who wants to come along and celebrate, because we have a very diverse community. For some, it's a protest, and for others, it's a celebration. Let's embrace each other and bring that together and let it be a protest. Let's see better inclusion. Let's see proper equality. Let's fight for our local council to make sure that all their colleagues and all their staff have training around what LGBT is and about those barriers, about living in a community which is maybe not as welcoming as we would all like. And that's the kind of censorship I would talk about, where it was at the beginning a new thing. It was like, oh my God, gays in Durham, or watch your children, be careful because they'll start turning everybody LGBT, to an actual, over the 5 or 6 years, to actually, this is just one day, which is part of what we do. I would say though, 3 years ago, I received death threats. I don't think it's uncommon within Pride organisations, but I received death threats so seriously that the police had to advise around wearing equipment, putting extra police on the parade element of it, because they were directed. They made an arrest and deported somebody. So they was took seriously, but it wasn't that far after Joe Cox was sadly murdered. And I think they were keen to make sure that none of that happened on the parade. We do receive threats every year.
The pandemic is going to be a particular challenge for LGBTQ people in remote areas. COVID-19 has sadly meant the cancellation of this summer's Pride 2020, but Mel's work is undaunted.
People from the LGBT community will now feel even more isolated than before. So what we're doing is we're using Facebook, we're using our Twitter, we're telephoning, and we're continuing to do our work around helping victims of same-sex domestic violence and abuse and sexual violence, and we're still offering that one-to-one support through Microsoft Teams and things like that. But it all comes at a cost, and at this moment, I believe it's going to be a decision at the end of next month how we go forward.
He said the support of big institutions in Durham was making an enormous difference to recent prides.
Durham Cathedral, the staff of Durham Cathedral, joined us on our parade, joined us with a banner, and joined us to celebrate the LGBT community. And that for us was a massive step forward when we talk about these kind of things. The cathedral themselves received a lot of hate mail, received a lot of anti-LGBT kind of rhetoric, but they were there, and that was a big step forward. So I think as we move forward, each year was bringing us more and more gain. And that censorship certainly started, I think, at the beginning, but as it's become part of the part of the year in Durham, it's one of the largest now free festivals in Durham. And as that's happened, that censorship seems to have lessened and lessened.
Looking again at Jennifer's research, it's impossible to unpick old ideas around censorship with current perspectives from LGBTQ communities. I guess a more difficult question is about what happens next in these uncertain times. From my conversations both here in Durham and internationally, the impact of research like this is just so important. People still want to share stories, and censorship hasn't gone away. But progress has been made. We want to support Pride parties and protests this summer. So, if you want to join the discussion, please share this podcast on your social media channels.